Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I am joined by Matías Vernengo, founding editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics and professor of economics at Bucknell University. Our conversation today will delve into Matías's latest book, Dollar Hegemony, which he co-edited along with Thomas Pally and Esteban Pérez Caldente. Additionally, given Matías's expertise in Argentina, we will explore the economic circumstances that contributed to Javier Milei's election. Welcome, Matías. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I would like to start out by discussing dollar hegemony. Could you provide a brief overview of the main themes and debates that you covered in the book?
So it's an edited book, first of all. So there are contributions by Michel Petit, by several other authors. I'm thinking Ben Cohen, by the editors and many other contributions. The idea was to discuss from different perspectives. So some people that think that dollar hegemony is perhaps at an end, and that we are seeing the decline of the dollar and the rise of the Chinese currency, or at least of a multi-currency, multipolar, financial or monetary system. And those like myself, Tom Paley, we normally are right with Steban, I should say, that think that dollar hegemony is, at least for now, here to stay. So these are papers that explore that, and they're all part of a special issue, I should say, of the Review of Keynesian Economics. So to some extent, it explores the issues of what it means to be a hegemonic currency. It explores issues of you know the rivalry between the United States and China. The possible there is obviously a hegemonic dispute between China and the United States, and in some areas, obviously, in terms of industrial production, it was in the news these days. Chinese manufacturing production now, it's more or less the same size as the United States and Europe combined, Western Europe. And so in that sense, there is an obvious sort of challenge to American hegemony. I think this yesterday on Twitter there was all of this discussion on Elon Musk asking for protection, and comparing to his views a decade or so ago, when he laughed about Chinese electric cars. So in that sense, that's an obvious arena. But there is a discussion of our views in which, not just recently. So we tend to think of the um, end of Bretton Woods as a period in which American, or dollar hegemony, I should say, rather than decline. It's the period in which, in a sense, it achieves its apogee. Its highest sort of mark, in the sense that at that point we have a system, a global system, a global financial system, that it's based on the dollar, and the dollar is not tied to any sort of metallic standard. And in that sense, the degrees of freedom that the United States have are endless. So it's a little bit about those issues.
So many people in our audience are not specialized in economics, as is the case with you. So, how would you explain the concept and also the implications of dollar hegemony, particularly how it confers economic and political privileges on the US to non economists?
So I think that one can make simple parallels with money, and I'm sorry to say the common sense view of money among people is that money has some sort of intrinsic value. So there is this notion that you know money is gold or money is silver. I always say to my students here, silver is actually the normal standard. We in languages like Spanish, like French, the word for money is silver. Plata is both silver and money. Uh, that's how entrenched that notion is, and obviously it goes back to antiquity. But really, when you look at that history, so when you look at the people that had studied, not economists, numismatics and those things, anthropologists, people that actually look at the origins of money. The origins of money are associated to uh, to state power. It's a unit of account. It's a language, so to speak, as Keynes said, John Maynard Keynes. And he did study, the ancients and Babylonic money and all of those things, and it was imposed, by the temple, by the as a way of imposing, a certain authority. So money is, it's a language, and Keynes said it's the, whoever chooses the dictionary, and of course, in many ways, metallic standards were used because it was a simple way of, imposing that authority. And so the hegemony at the global level of a particular currency also comes with power, and it's the power to determine what's going to be used to settle international contracts, and not fundamentally trade, although at the beginning of the modernization process it is about trade, but financial contracts. And so historically, because the rise of capitalism is in Western Europe, the metallic standards have been, essentially, Western European and Western European offshoots, currencies. So it was essentially the Venetian ducat, the Dutch guilder, the pound, and the U.S. dollar. So those have been the international currencies. All of them with some limitations, because all of them had, to be in the international arena tied to a metallic standard, with the exception of the dollar, that since 1971, since August 71, when Bretton Woods finally ends, in a sense. And Bretton Woods was the system that tied the dollar to gold and all the other currencies to the dollar. The dollar is the key currency. So if I had to explain it to a non-economist, so why is the dollar the key currency? Because oil and other energy products, and you cannot have production without energy commodities, are priced in dollars. And the United States has 900 military bases around the world to make sure that those contracts and the pricing of oil is in dollars. And there are many advantages of that. I mean, for example, the whole position of the United States in the Middle East is ultimately associated. The United States doesn't take these days, for almost 2 decades now, not significant amounts of oil from the Middle East. It goes fundamentally to China. So the U.S. is in there because it gives it control of international financial matters, and because it obviously allows some control to access to this essential commodity for rivals. uh, but at any rate, if you think of the benefits that come with this, I always give an example. So let's say that you're in Argentina, and we're going to talk about Argentina, and you do something crazy like Milei did. You devalue the currency 100%, more than 100%, really. So once devalue the currency more than 100%, even if the barrel of oil continues to be, let's say it was at 70 something, per barrel, the price of oil all of a sudden is 100% more expensive in pesos, all of a sudden. So you have brutal inflation. Why? Because oil enters the production of everything. If you want to eat, lunch, you have to pay for the transportation of the things that go into your lunch, and you're paying, for this conversation. We're using energy, and to some extent that goes into some form of energy, and so on and so forth. So if you increase, and if you devalue the dollar, which people think that because it's a standard, it can devalue. So if you devalue the dollar, the barrel of oil is still $70, and it doesn't affect the American economy. So the inflationary impacts that you have from the variation of the prices of currencies, it's something that the United States is completely immune. Also, China. I'm not saying Argentina. Actually, Argentina doesn't have reserves, but think Brazil, where I grew up. And Brazil is sitting on 350 something billion dollars, and at the central bank. And most countries, including China, has 3.2 or 3.1, I don't know how much exactly, $1 trillion at the at the central bank, at the People's Bank of China. The United States holds exactly zero reserves of international currency. So the United States essentially has an ability to spend in its own currency and borrow in its own currency. And this is a fundamental distinction that makes, in many ways, Raul Prebisch, Argentinian economist that was the father of structuralism and the head of ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference of Trade and Development. He talked about center and periphery, and he thought that it was essentially when you export commodities. In modern terms, being a peripheral country is that you don't have the key international currency, or you don't have enough of it at least. And there are a few currencies that do. The euro is an international currency. The pound is an international currency. The renminbi, limited, but it's an international currency. But if you don't have, like, the peso, you are forced to hold humongous amounts of this, sort of currency. And so, being a developing country, it limits your ability of what you can do, because you have to borrow if you're going to have, problems in your financial account or your current account. If your current trade deficits and so on and so forth, you have to borrow in dollars, and you have to pay in dollars, and to pay in dollars you have to export. The United States doesn't need that, because the United States always borrows in its own currency. And so that's a great advantage. That's the greatest advantage of having the dollar. It gives the United States an ability, let's put it, in an exaggerated but not incorrect way, without limits. The limits to the ability of the United States economy to actually go and spend are even before you hit the obvious constraints of what you are able to do physically. Uh, are political. So it's, right wingers may not want to spend on having more social programs. Some progressive people may not be willing to spend money in bombing other people. But given the differences, political differences, sometimes they cannot agree on a fiscal package and how much to spend and whatnot. But that's a political problem. It's not like in the case of Argentina, a problem that we don't have dollars.
Right. I want to change topics a little bit, but not fully. I still want to talk about dollar hegemony, but I want to shift towards talking about something that we've covered in previous interviews, which is economic sanctions, which is a strategy that has been commonly adopted by the United States to maintain its global hegemony, to a certain extent, right? So would you say that dollar hegemony is a determining factor for the success of the United States sanctions policy? How would you say these two things are related, right? So the sanctions policy of the United States and dollar hegemony.
Oh, they're crucially, connected, and absolutely right that this one follows from the other. So the United States uses, again, think about it. I told you there are 900 military bases around in order to guarantee, among other things, that the dollar is the hegemonic currency. So the imperial sort of nature of American foreign policy is tied to and connected to this, notion of dollar hegemony. And and of course, there are previous sort of. I mean, the United States is not the first country to try to impose, sanctions and use sanctions as a form of controlling the functioning of the global economy. You can go to ancient times. In Greek city states, they used some of those things. And I think the most famous is the Napoleonic Wars and the blockade, that Napoleon tries to impose on England. The use of sanctions, if you don't have access to dollars, and the United States has sort of eased this issue that sort of imposes limitations on the ability of countries to grow in a very sort of clear geopolitical sort of form. The example that I like to use to explain this is, think of Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan, nobody would doubt, are developed countries these days. And the fundamental characteristic about Germany and Japan is that they lost the war against the United States in 1945, and by losing the war, uh, you know they gained the access to because of the Soviet Union on the one hand and China on the other. So the rise of communists, in geopolitical borders that were relevant, they open up what some people have called development by invitation. So the example I give, these days we always talk about electric cars, but the number one, auto company, if you think in terms of not the value of the company, but the number of cars produced, is Toyota. So it's still Toyota, the symbol of the post-Fordist sort of world. So it's a company that, Toyotism is just in time. It's, the opposite of Fordism in a sense. So Toyota was broke in the early 50s. And what happened? The United States is fighting a war in Korea. And so the United States Army says, you know what, bringing trucks and jeeps from all the way from the United States is sort of terrible. So, here's, we'll give you, first of all, the technology. We'll give you the standards, the, how, and what are the qualifications, which is essential for the process of development. So we're transferring technology in a way that achieves the frontier of what is needed technology. So this car, these jeeps, these trucks, they have to be resistant to conditions of war. We're going to give you, more importantly, dollars. So you don't have money to import the parts that are necessary. Don't worry, we'll cover that. I mean, they have the dollars. And the first, the last and even more important, we guarantee you that you have demand. So you're going to have profits. Why? Because you're going to buy all the trucks, all the jeeps, all the cars that you can produce for our war effort in the Korean Peninsula. So the Korean Peninsula, and they're in the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, and they're still in Japan and in Germany. There are military bases in those places. They never left. So they're still in Okinawa. So those explain how you get in Japan the catching up. Sure, they had a history. I'm not denying here that the processes of development are more complex, but certainly American hegemony and the lifting in this case of what is a tremendous sort of embargo, sanction, whether you have or not have dollars. So imposing those may be a severe constraint to growth. I should say, in the case of Russia these days, because it's one of the places in which these sanctions have been sort of imposed. Like in Latin America, I should say Cuba is the fundamental sort of example, and Venezuela, very effective in both cases. In Russia, it has been ineffective. Why? Because China is there. China has sort of allowed and the United States itself has had some interest in in allowing some of the Russian oil and natural gas to go, not necessarily to Europe, but to other parts of the world, so that the prices are more or less not out of control and we don't have too much inflation. And in that sense, it has forced an industrial policy. In Russia, Russia is making the old import substitution, things that were produced and bought outside, in ways that the Putin regime would not have been able to do. So this notion that sanctions in the case of Russia have backfired is something that Jamie Galbraith from the University of Texas has discussed recently, and I think he's correct on that.
There's currently a lot of discussion surrounding the potential of multipolarity, and you already addressed this at the beginning, kind of. And there's this focus always on the idea that the Chinese currency could supplant the dominance of the dollar. I want to know more about your perspective in the matter, but also about how this debate is addressed in the book, also by people who maybe have the opposite perspective than you do.
Yes, well, I think Michel Petit. That's what the name came to mind. He thinks differently than certainly I do, at least on this particular issue, and there is a sense uh, that the rise of China is seen by many as something that it's the culmination of a long process of decadence of the United States. So I think that part of the story starts in the differences and how you see the end of Bretton Woods. So most people tend to see the end of Bretton Woods, as I said, as the beginning of the collapse of the United States. So they compare the end of Bretton Woods with, say, the interwar period when England sort of and the pound sort of lost hegemonic power. The obvious difference is that when England, lost hegemonic power, after the First World War, and there is a protracted sort of crisis of capitalism that, it's the interwar period is, it's the Great Depression. So it's the result of that hegemonic crisis. The British model of, 19th century Victorian sort of liberalism collapses with it. So you have, on the one hand, communism. You have, of course, fascism that has to be, but you have the rise of the welfare state in United States and Western Europe, which is not the. It's a different model. It's a capitalist model that is forced to moderate its uh, most savage sort of instincts, so to speak. Uh, the collapse of Bretton Woods, which I think it's more of a policy decision, so I don't think it's really a collapse. So the United States decides, oh, we're gonna stop giving you gold in exchange for dollars, and that's it. And there is a crisis in the 70s, but it's not a crisis of the ideological model behind the United States. It's actually a recovery, if you want, of a much deeper, in a sense of what the American model was. It's the recovery of this old liberal sort of in new clothes. It's neoliberalism, and it goes to the point that 20 something years after the collapse of Bretton Woods, you have the epitome of the victory of capitalism, of neoliberal, no restraints, savage capitalism, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, and you can think of the fall of the wall in Berlin as sort of the previous sort of. So in that respect, it's a complete ideological victory of the American system. Sure enough, over the last now 15 years or so, since the 2008 9 sort of crisis, 15, 16 years, we've seen that this model, again, because unrestrained capitalism does lead to financial crisis, does lead to the need of the welfare state coming back and to contain, if not at least the worst effects socially, at least for the corporations, so to save capitalism from themselves. We have seen a sort of a return of in many ways of Keynesian policies, or whatever people want to call it. So the idea that fiscal policy matters, and this, that, and the other. So it's in that context that I think we have to think broadly of this sort of hegemonic disputes. And so it's in a context in which the end of Bretton Woods is seen as a, a policy decision by American elites of how to reorganize the world economy. And in that sort of process, they co-opted back then. So it's Kissinger, that passed away recently, that opened up China. That said, in order to contain, in part of the same strategy, they're ending Bretton Woods, they're opening up China, and they're doing both things in a sense, in many ways, to promote capitalism and to disarm the Soviet, at that in that point, the Soviet sort of threat. What happens is that China develops itself. That China, probably the Chinese, do see their long period for us in the West, 200 years of dominance by the West since the Opium Wars, almost 200 years, as a blip in history. So they do have. So although the United States did the same thing that it did with Japan and Germany, that I suggested, it opened up China. It promoted development by invitation in China. It transferred technology. It allowed, in many ways, directly and indirectly, it allowed them to copy things. Now they're trying to crush on that, saying you cannot copy. Copyright is essential. We're not going to allow you to take our technology and reverse engineer it, which all countries that develop, in the past have done. So that now is seen, I think, by American elites very clearly. It started more clearly with Trump, and has been adopted by Biden and part of the democratic neoliberal progressive sort of elites. So I do see that there is a challenge to dollar hegemony. The problem is that at this point, if we talk numbers, the renminbi is probably 3% of international reserves. The dollar is still about 60% of dollar reserves in central banks, and it was that back when, in 1973, 71. So there's no significant change in those numbers. So to what extent, you know, we will see anytime soon a significant change is something to be seen. So I'm skeptical. I'm not saying that there is no challenge, but I'm skeptical that we are on the verge of a great transformation. So I don't think that that's the case. We're in the middle of a period of transition and of conflict. That's for sure.